Hey everyone. I recently did a little interview with Nicole Leaner, and it was around these mind body blocks. And I wanted to elaborate even a little bit more on my thoughts around this concept. Sometimes we call them mental blocks in sport, sometimes they're referred to as performance blocks. This was something that I recently heard from Tom Forster, who is my former coach and also the high performance director for the current U.S. women's gymnastics team. And I think, mental block is definitely a word that does not encompass the complexity of these phenomena. And I think performance block is maybe a little bit closer to an accurate description of what's going on. But I wanted to talk even in more, in more detail around the complexity of these phenomena. And in order to be able to really help athletes, one, even prevent them from happening, maybe that's a possibility. Or if they do happen, which they happen more often than we know about, we know what to do. We can address it more holistically and support our athletes even better. We have to remember that our brains have trillions of neuronal connections, and these connections are dispersed throughout our bodies. And so we have to remember that if we call this a mental block, we are really underestimating the complexity of what's going on. So I just can't reiterate that enough, that we have to look at the whole body and the physiology of what's going on in the brain and the body, and how then that connection of mind body plays into all of this. When I was watching the Olympics the other day after the team, or during the team final, when Simone did her vault, and she was supposed to do a Yurchenko 2.5 and she did a 1.5, I heard her say afterwards, how they sometimes film them on the sides and you can get a little taste of what they're saying. You can hear what they're saying in the background. And Simone said, "I just don't trust myself." And it made me think of my experience with chronic illness and how, I went from being a very high level athlete. I had definitely dealt with these performance blocks and understood that level of not trusting the body. And then dealing with an ongoing health issue, that same feeling of I don't trust my body. And it can feel so out of control, whether you are completely able-bodied and functioning at the highest level and the highest level of sports performance, or disabled and the body isn't even able to go and do its day-to-day functions. So there's this underlying experience of lack of trust in the body. So after I heard that and kind of made this connection between my own experience, I started thinking of other similarities between ongoing health challenges and trying to keep the body performing at the top. And even though they seem like completely opposite ends of the spectrum of functioning, they are opposite ends of the spectrum of functioning. You've got high-level elite athletes that are functioning at the highest end, and then you've got disability and chronic illness, and again, like functioning on the lower end of the spectrum. But there's a lot of overlap in healing from chronic illness and also dealing with some of the things that come with high-level performance. These performance blocks, or I'm going to call them mind-body blocks because I don't know a better word right now, so again, the connection between healing from chronic illness and trying to recover from these mind-body blocks, there's a lot of overlap. I think there's a lot that we can learn from the chronic illness spectrum, interestingly enough, and maybe paradoxically, that can be applied to helping athletes perform and function at the highest level. So I wanted to break it down into four kind of themes and 4 areas that I have learned a lot trying to recover my own health and thinking, wow, this might actually be applicable to high-level athletes in working with these mind-body blocks. So the first is looking at the maladaptive stress response. The second is to look at the role of trauma and its effect in the body. The third piece is we're going to look at this ever-evolving field of psycho, neuro, immuno-endocrinology. It's a mouthful, but I'll break it down. And then the fourth piece is how illness can serve as a wake-up call, and how can we look at these mind-body blocks in a similar way, that they can be a wake-up call to something deeper. Okay, so the first piece that I want to look at is this maladaptive stress response. What does that actually mean? We all have this innate capacity within ourselves to handle stress. We have a fight, flight, or freeze response in the face of life or death. And basically what happens is, if there is a threat to our life, we have a protective mechanism that releases stress hormones and allows us to have, maybe extra power and strength and focus. It shuts down digestion. It shuts down non-essential functioning in the body so that we can flee or fight for our life. So it helps us in life or death situations. We've all heard of fight or flight, but I think the protective mechanism that we haven't heard of a lot is the freeze response. And this is basically when the body just shuts down. And this is something that animals do in nature to play dead, or, we've heard play possum, or they play dead, and so their predator may not be interested in them anymore. And I think, there might be something here with that freeze response and these mind-body blocks. So there's a part of our nervous system called the vagus nerve, and this nerve is involved, part of this nerve called the dorsal vagal nerve is part of that shutdown response or that freeze response. And I'm wondering if this freeze response in the body is similar to a performance block, mind-body block, where the body almost freezes. It's like what Simone said, I can't even imagine twisting anymore. And if you were to see her, if you go back and look at the video of her doing her vault, you could see midair, her eyes kind of go back. Her eyes are just like, not focused on anything. They kind of roll back in her head. And it's almost like she just freezes up midair. And so I think if maybe we can look at this freeze response a little more closely and potentially be able to help our athletes if we can understand this freeze response. And basically what I'm thinking of is, if stress hormones stay elevated for a prolonged period of time. So if a person is in fight or flight, I'm talking more about fight or flight right now. If they're in fight or flight for a prolonged period of time, it then puts the whole nervous system into a chronic stress response. So the brain and the body are constantly being flooded with these stress hormones. So even though the body is not in a life or death situation, it doesn't know how to shut that off anymore. And so if the nervous system is being impacted in this way, our bodies are complex systems and they don't exist in a vacuum. So it's not like the nervous system exists alone. The musculoskeletal system exists alone. It's not like that. It's a complex system of systems. So if one system, the nervous system, say, is flipped into overdrive, so what should be just an acute one-time stress response becomes a chronic stress response, it can then affect the immune system, the hormones, and then, of course, our minds and our thought patterns. And it's easy to see how this can happen in elite sports, that stress response just gets flipped into overdrive because the demands of both training and competition, and now we've got demands from social media and media in general, the culture at large. It's such a stressful arena. And so it's it's easy to see how an athlete might go into this maladaptive stress response. So something that should just be a one-time fight or flight kind of turns into a chronic stress response. And then the body starts to go into freeze. And it might sound weird that something that was evolutionarily given to us for life or death situations then becomes something that interferes with sports performance. But I think there might be something there. So that's the first piece, this maladaptive stress response. The body's in constant fight or flight, and then it starts to go into this freeze or this shutdown mode. The second piece that I wanted to look at here is the role of trauma in the body and how it affects health and performance. I recently saw a study that cited that 13 to 27% of athletes suffer from PTSD, and it varies depending upon the sport. But this PTSD could be from an injury, physical trauma, accident that occurred during sports competition or sports training, witnessing crashes in their teammates or other competitors. And then sometimes just that low-grade stress of the culture, of the demands of high-level performance. And so to go back to the similarities between chronic illness and high-level performance, with chronic illness, there's something called an adverse childhood event score, and oftentimes people with chronic illness have higher scores of these adverse events and trauma earlier in life. And so for chronic illness, addressing the trauma that's held in the body can help in recovering from chronic illness. And I think we can learn something from this in the performance realm. So athletes endure a lot of trauma, physically and psychologically, and the body can store this trauma. Unresolved trauma can then contribute to that heightened stress response. What I talked about before, maladaptive. Maladaptive meaning that it's not serving. It's an adaptation, but it's kind of gone awry. And so this is what can happen in the body and, of course, psyche. This, again, we can't tease apart the two. It's a mind-body. But if there is a lot of trauma stored, then physically and psychologically, it manifests and it hinders performance in athletes. Eventually, what can happen is this heightened stress response leads to that freeze response. And I think of it as like the body saying, no, no more. There's a lot of innate wisdom in the body that we tend to override. And if we don't listen to the signs that it's giving us, eventually it just says, no, I'm not doing this anymore. I have been reading a book called When the Body Says No by Gabor Mate. And again, it's geared more towards physical illness and chronic health challenges. But with these blocks, I think it's a similar phenomenon. It's like the body and all of its innate wisdom saying, I've been giving you some signs, there's been a lot of pressure and stress, or I'm not getting enough sleep, or whatever it may be, all the factors leading up to it that contribute to so much stress in the body that it eventually just kind of freezes up and says, nope, I'm not doing this anymore. So to return to this trauma in the body piece, Peter Levine and Bessel van der Kolk are two doctors in the field of trauma therapy, and their focus is on reconnecting with the body and allowing for a deeper healing that's beyond talk therapy. So we can understand these things at the level of the mind. We can talk through them. Athletes know when they go through these blocks that it's not really a rational thing. One day they're able to do it, and the next day they're not. So to talk through it is sometimes futile. It doesn't get anybody anywhere. But, this saying the issues are in our tissues, I think we can learn from that the trauma that gets stored in our bodies, the only way that it can be healed and processed and released is to do a trauma-informed therapy, which I'm not going to go into a whole lot of detail, but one of them is called somatic experiencing. You can look it up. It is Peter Levine, I think, does something along the lines of somatic experiencing. And it's kind of based on how animals behave in nature, interestingly enough. So Peter Levine, I went to, I think it was some kind of a conference with him several years ago, and he was showing a video of a polar bear in nature, and he had been traumatized. Something had traumatized him, and he had gone into a complete freeze response. So he shut down. This polar bear looked like he was dead. And then they continued to watch him, and within a few minutes, his whole body started shaking for, a minute, 5 minutes. And then the polar bear got up and walked away. And it was just interesting. There was this discharge within the nervous system, this release of energy from the shutdown, from the freeze response. He discharged it, the body was shaking, and then he walked up and, went about his business. So there's something to be learned from this. We oftentimes, especially athletes who are very good at masking symptoms and pushing through things, they may endure a trauma or multiple traumas, and nothing is really processed. So maybe at the time of the trauma, if they're able to vocalize and do some of these trauma-based interventions where they're really focused on getting in touch with how does the body actually feel in this moment, and allowing things to start moving through whatever sensations are felt. It's an interesting process that I can't fully explain. It's just something that has to be experienced, but it's basically, it all falls under the umbrella of a trauma-informed therapy, that maybe this is something that we could bring into the athletic world to help athletes process trauma at the time of the incident or around the time of the incident, so that these traumas don't get stored in the body and then potentially lead to the maladaptive stress response and then ultimately a freeze response. Okay, so those are two key ideas. The third is, again, looking at some of the data and research around healing from chronic illness, this field called psychoneuroimmunoendocrinology, which basically, if you break each component of the word down, psycho, we're talking about the psyche, the mind, neuro, the brain, and the entirety of the nervous system, immuno, the immune system, so how we deal with inflammation and infection, and then endocrine, so our hormonal system, sex hormones and stress hormones, and how all of this is so intricately connected. So if we can take this holistic approach in healing from chronic illness, maybe we can take this approach with our high-level athletes, because they, of all people, require mind-body in almost perfect balance, not only for optimal performance, but for health during their career and after their career, and for safety. I mean, this was a key issue with Simone, was really it came down to safety, that if we push through these things, people can end up debilitated for life. So again, I mean, just this is looking back at the point of, if we just say that this is a psychological phenomenon and we call it a mental block, we are missing a big part of the picture, and a lot of opportunity for helping in the recovery. And then finally, the fourth idea of, for me, being sick has been awful. It really has. I wouldn't wish this upon anybody, and I would not wish it upon myself, but that illness can be a wake-up call. And I think these blocks can sometimes be a wake-up call. It can help us ask the deeper questions of what's actually going on in this athlete's life right now that might be causing this fear response. What's causing them to freeze up? As a PA, I try to look at each patient holistically. So nutrition and movement, social support, stress management, sleep, what is their relationship like with themselves to ensure optimal health. So we need to do this with our athletes, with our high level athletes. We need a full team of support, which I think we're moving towards that. I mean, there's always room for improvement, but um, fortunately, I think we are getting better in this area. But we need to be asking these questions. You know, when an athlete presents with a mind body block like this, we ask, are they eating in a way that's fueling them optimally? I mean, in gymnastics, we know that eating disorders are present, and or even if there's not disordered eating, are they fueling themselves in a balanced way? Is their brain getting the nutrients that it needs to be able to perform at the level that is being demanded of them? Are they getting adequate and refreshing sleep? Do they have a healthy relationship with friends, with family, with themselves? Are they maybe overtraining? Because overtraining has a huge impact on the hormonal system, which that then can impact sleep and digestion and the body's ability to recover. Is somebody being pushed too far too fast? This was my own experience when I was little. I was 10 years old and I had just qualified for junior elite, and I was being pushed too far too fast, and I started developing a whole host of mind-body blocks. I would run down the vault runway and I would stop. I would cast on bars to do either a giant or a Tkachev, or, go into my dismount, and I would just stop. I would just balk, is what we call it, or bail out. And it really had an impact on me. And I think it was my young body's way of saying, no, I am not ready for this. So I think if we can look at this freeze response as a symptom of a deeper need, that it's not the problem in and of itself, it's a symptom, that we may be able to offer the help that's needed. I know personally, I know my coaches were always super frustrated. These are frustrating phenomenon for athletes, coaches, probably the parents. But I do believe that if we shift the framework around it and we understand it a little bit better, that everybody will potentially have a little bit more patience and maybe even some compassion. That these are not, people don't choose to have these, and so the patience and compassion can help support the process of recovery. I think coaches obviously need to continue to go back to the basics of training, go back to doing timers and drills and going into pits and getting spotted and retrain the body how to do it. I think that's a piece of it. And then I think the other piece is maybe returning to the basics of living, where this is where present moment awareness and mindfulness practices can be so helpful, that this helps to train the mind to be here now, not thinking about the future, not stuck in the past, really being present in the body in this moment. So what we can do is, we can teach athletes about mindfulness. In my mindfulness in sport course, I talk a lot about what mindfulness is and how it changes our brain in many positive ways. So we educate on what mindfulness is, and then we can also teach them how to just simply become aware of their breath in the moment. How simple that sounds, but it's something that helps settle the mind a little bit. So that's one piece, just breath awareness practices, along with maybe learning how to manipulate the breath in a way that brings balance to the nervous system. So an interesting book called Breath by James Nestor talks about how important it is to breathe in and out through the nose and a count of 5.5 seconds in, 5.5 seconds out, to find a level of balance in both the parasympathetic, which that's like the rest and digest part of our nervous system for the most part, and the sympathetic, which is like the one that kind of ramps us up. It's kicked in high level competition, and but simple breath practices that we can teach our athletes to help stabilize, to bring balance to the body mind. There's also another really powerful practice called a body scan. And it's just learning to be in one's body, feeling sensations without having to fix anything, perfect anything, or judge it as good or bad. And this can be a really powerful buffer to the constant stress and criticism of high level athletics. I don't think we're ever going to get away from judgment and criticism in sport. It's needed. We have to have that judgment and criticism. I mean, it can be constructive criticism, but it's needed in order to excel and in order to improve. But I think what can happen is the brain kind of gets switched into that hypercritical mode and it doesn't know how to decompress from it. And so once again, that's another factor that can contribute to this maladaptive stress response where the body is constantly in a heightened state of stress. And so something like mindfulness, a body scan practice, helps train the brain in a different way. It's basically saying, okay, in practice, I can be this way. And outside of the gym or the court or wherever they train, outside of that sports arena, I can actually learn to be in my body in a different way that isn't so hypercritical, that isn't so judgmental. It's just kind of learning how to be with what is and listen to the body in a different way. And the last piece that I want to talk about here, I mentioned earlier about the freeze response and how it's involved. The freeze response and how the vagus nerve is involved in this reaction in the body. The vagus nerve is an interesting nerve. It originates at the base of the brain in what's called the brainstem, and it's a cranial nerve. We have 12 cranial nerves, and the vagus nerve is the 10th cranial nerve. We have 2 of them, and there are branches of this nerve. There's a ventral branch, and there's a dorsal branch. And if you want to get scientific and nerdy about this, you can read something called the polyvagal theory by Stephen Porges. And he talks about in detail this nerve. And interestingly, the dorsal part of this nerve is what they found to be involved in that freeze response. And so maybe, again, I'm just kind of hypothesizing because I couldn't find any research on these things, but maybe it could be a stimulus for doing more research. But maybe if we can get the ventral part of the nerve, so again, the dorsal part of the nerve is what's involved in the freeze response. The ventral part of the nerve is what's involved in like social engagement and ease and just a sense of balance in the body. And so there are actually maybe silly little exercises that we can do to activate the ventral part of the vagus nerve. And so things like gargling, humming, these are things that activate that part of the nerve. And another meditation practice called loving kindness. These are interesting things that maybe we can add to the toolkit of an athlete to help them in recovering from these mental blocks. So I know this is a lot. I just wanted to share my thoughts on it. It's somewhat scientific, but I would love to continue the conversation with anybody who is interested in hopefully, share and support our athletes to the best of our ability.